The congregation thought little Richard was having a stroke. It was Sunday morning, June 13, 1999, at the Faith Temple Church of God in Christ in Nashville, and he was supposed to be giving testimony about his return to faith, his rejection of the sinful rock and roll lifestyle, the usual redemption story he'd been performing for decades. But halfway through his testimony, his voice broke, his hands started shaking, and he gripped the pulpit like he was about to fall. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 46 years ago, I made a deal, not with a record label, not with a manager. I made a deal at a crossroads in Mississippi with a man who promised me everything I ever wanted. The church went silent. A few people shifted uncomfortably, thinking this was metaphor, spiritual language about temptation and sin. But little Richard kept talking, and the details were too specific, too precise to be symbolic. He described the exact location, the date, the time of night, the color of the man's suit, the words of the offer. He described saying yes, shaking hands, and feeling something change inside him, like a door opening that could never be closed. Then he stopped, looked at the congregation with tears streaming down his face, and said, "And I've been trying to break that deal ever since, but you can't break it, you can only run." For the next 21 years until his death in 2020, little Richard never mentioned that confession again. But the tape of that sermon exists, and what he said in those 17 minutes rewrites everything we thought we knew about the birth of rock and roll. Before we continue with this story, if you want to explore the hidden truths behind music's greatest legends, please subscribe to our channel. These investigations take months of research, and your support helps us uncover the secrets that shape the music you love. The legend that refuses to die. The Crossroads deal is America's oldest musical myth, embedded so deeply in blues culture that it's become impossible to separate fact from folklore. The most famous version belongs to Robert Johnson, the Mississippi Delta blues guitarist, who allegedly met the devil at the intersection of Highway 61 and Highway 49 in Clarksdale sometime in the mid-1930s. According to legend, Johnson was a mediocre guitarist who went to the crossroads at midnight and waited. A large black man appeared, took Johnson's guitar, tuned it, played a few songs, and handed it back. From that moment on, Johnson could play like no one had ever heard, his technique so advanced, his style so revolutionary, that other musicians insisted it was supernatural. He recorded 29 songs in 1936 and 1937, then died in 1938 at age 27, allegedly poisoned. But here's what music historians don't discuss. Robert Johnson wasn't the only musician who claimed to have made a crossroads deal. In the decades after Johnson's death, at least a dozen other blues, gospel, and early rock musicians told similar stories, always involving the same location, always describing a well-dressed stranger who offered them everything in exchange for something they couldn't quite articulate. Most of those musicians are forgotten now, their careers brief, their lives troubled. But one of them became the most influential performer in rock and roll history, and in 1999, standing in a Nashville church, he finally admitted what had happened 46 years earlier. Throughout his career, little Richard had made cryptic references to a turning point in 1953, a moment when everything changed, when he went from struggling nobody to having the vision that would create rock and roll. He'd talk about it in spiritual terms, saying God had given him a gift, or sometimes the opposite, that the devil had tempted him. The story kept changing, but the year remained constant, 1953, and the location, when he mentioned it at all, was always Mississippi, always a crossroads, always late at night. Music biographers treated these references as metaphor, the kind of myth-making that performers engage in to make their origin stories more dramatic. But the people who knew him best knew he wasn't exaggerating. Something had happened in 1953, something that gave him the power to invent a new form of music, but also trapped him in a cycle of performance and repentance that lasted until his death. The Summer of Desperation. To understand why Richard Penniman was at a Mississippi crossroads in August 1953, you have to understand how close he was to giving up completely. He was 20 years old and had been trying to make it as a professional musician since he was 14. He'd recorded songs for RCA Victor in 1951 and 1952, rhythm and blues numbers that went nowhere. He was broke, living in his car, driving from town to town, playing for $20 a night when he could find work. His family had mostly disowned him for his flamboyant behavior, and his friends were suggesting he find a real job. Richard had talent, but talent in 1953 America wasn't enough if you were black, poor, and openly effeminate. The music industry was segregated, controlled by white executives who saw black musicians as raw material to be exploited. Even if Richard created something revolutionary, there was no guarantee he'd get credit for it. In late July 1953, Richard was playing at a club in Atlanta when he overheard two older musicians talking about the Crossroads legend. One of them said Robert Johnson had been exactly where Richard was now. Talented but going nowhere, desperate enough to try anything. And after the Crossroads meeting, everything changed overnight. Richard asked where the Crossroads was, and the musician told him Highway 61 and Highway 49 in Clarksdale, Mississippi. The musician said people still went there, musicians who'd run out of options, and sometimes they came back different. On August 7, 1953, Richard drove to Clarksdale. He told himself he was just passing through, but that was a lie. He drove there specifically to see the Crossroads, to stand at the intersection where Robert Johnson had supposedly made his deal. He arrived late in the afternoon and waited in his car, watching the intersection as if expecting something to materialize in daylight. Nothing happened. The Crossroads looked ordinary, just two highways meeting in a small Mississippi town, cars passing through, people going about their business. But as the sun went down and the streets emptied, something changed. The intersection looked different, darker than it should have been given the streetlights, quieter in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural, like sound didn't travel the way it was supposed to. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air took on a weight that made breathing feel slightly difficult. Richard sat in his car for almost 3 hours, working up the courage to get out, part of him hoping nothing would happen, part of him terrified something would. Finally, around 11 p.m., he stepped out of the car and walked to the center of the Crossroads. He stood there for a few minutes, feeling foolish, talking to himself about how stupid this was, how he'd driven 4 hours to stand in the middle of an empty street because of a ghost story. He was about to leave, about to give up on the whole thing, when he noticed a man standing on the corner, leaning against a street sign, watching him with an expression that suggested he'd been there the whole time, just waiting. The man at the Crossroads. Richard would describe this man in detail during the 1999 sermon, and the specificity made the congregation realize he wasn't speaking metaphorically. The man was tall, well-dressed in a dark suit, wearing rings on every finger that caught the streetlight in strange ways. His face was difficult to describe. Richard said he remembered every detail about the man except his face, which seemed to shift whenever he tried to focus on it. The man's voice was clear and smooth, the kind that made you want to trust it. The man spoke first, asking Richard what he was doing at the Crossroads. Richard said he'd come to see if the legend was true, if this was really where musicians made deals. The man smiled and asked what kind of deal Richard wanted. Richard said he wanted to be the greatest performer who ever lived, wanted to create music that would change the world, wanted fame and wealth and power. The man listened, and when Richard finished, asked what he was willing to give in exchange. Richard said he didn't know, asked what the price would be. The man said the price wasn't his soul, that was a misunderstanding. The price was simpler and more complicated. Richard would have to perform, not just on stage, but in life. He would have to become a character, something larger than himself. He would never be allowed to simply exist as Richard Penniman. He would have to be Little Richard, the performance every day for the rest of his life. And whenever he tried to stop performing, the gift would remind him of the deal, the music would haunt him, the stage would call him back, and the guilt would follow him everywhere. Richard said yes. In the 1999 sermon, he described shaking the man's hand. The grip was cold, unnaturally cold. The man gave Richard specific instructions. Go to New Orleans, find a studio called J&M, wait for the right moment, and when inspiration hit, don't hold back. Perform the way he'd always wanted to, but had been too afraid to, with all the wildness and femininity he'd been suppressing. The man said the world wasn't ready for what Richard would create, but that was the point. The world would have no choice but to change. Then the man stepped back into the shadows and was gone. Richard stood in the Crossroads for another 10 minutes, trying to process what had happened. His hand was still cold where the man had touched it. The birth of rock and roll. Richard drove to New Orleans in September 1953. He spent months hanging around J&M studio, building relationships with producers and engineers. One producer was Robert "Bumps" Blackwell, who worked for Specialty Records. In February 1955, Blackwell booked a session for Richard to record standard rhythm and blues numbers, but the session wasn't going well. Richard's voice sounded constrained, his piano playing competent but uninspired. After 3 hours, everyone could tell they weren't capturing anything special. The energy was flat, the performances mechanical. Blackwell was about to call the session a failure when they decided to take a break. Richard went to the piano and started playing something he'd been messing around with for months, a wild hammering rhythm with nonsense lyrics. This was the moment the man at the crossroads had told him to wait for. Richard launched into what would become Tutti Frutti, the original version with lyrics so explicitly sexual they couldn't be played on radio. The engineers and musicians stopped and stared. Blackwell recognized immediately that this was something completely new, something that didn't fit any existing category. They brought in a songwriter to clean up the lyrics and recorded it in 3 takes. When released in November 1955, Tutti Frutti became one of the most important records in popular music history. It reached number 2 on the Billboard Rhythm and Blues chart, but more importantly, it changed what was possible in popular music. The sound, the energy, the falsetto scream, the pounding piano, the blurring of gender lines, it detonated every rule. Little Richard had done exactly what the man at the crossroads had told him to do. He'd created something the world wasn't ready for, and the world had no choice but to change. The price becomes clear. But the success came with the exact cost the man had warned about. Little Richard couldn't just be Richard Penniman anymore. He had to be the performance, the persona, every moment of every day. Off stage, people expected the makeup, the pompadour, the sequined clothes. When he appeared in public without them, fans were disappointed or confused, asking what was wrong, why he wasn't being himself. But the persona wasn't his self. It was a costume he'd agreed to wear forever, and the weight of that realization grew heavier with each passing month. Interviews became performances of the performance. Talk show appearances required him to be even more exaggerated than on stage, and every public moment was scrutinized for authenticity to a character that was never meant to be authentic. The persona that had liberated him on stage became a prison everywhere else, and the guilt followed him everywhere. The church had taught him that femininity in men was sinful, that rock and roll music was the devil's work designed to corrupt youth and destroy moral values. Now he was the most flamboyant, the most openly feminine, the most successful rock and roll performer in the world, and every night he felt like he was damning himself. This is when the cycle started. Perform until the guilt became unbearable, quit music and return to the church, try to become righteous, discover the music wouldn't let him go, return to performing, feel the guilt build again, repeat. The first major quit happened in 1957, the famous airplane incident. But what he didn't mention until the 1999 sermon was that the airplane incident wasn't random. He'd been thinking about the Crossroads deal for weeks, feeling like he needed to escape. When the plane's engine caught fire and he thought he was about to die, he made another deal, this time with God. He promised that if the plane landed safely, he would quit rock and roll forever. The plane landed. Richard kept his promise, enrolled in Oakwood College, and began studying theology. But the original deal wouldn't let him go. The music kept calling him back, not just the desire to perform, but the actual music, the sound of it in his head, constant and insistent, like a voice that wouldn't be silenced. He'd be in church trying to pray, trying to focus on scripture and redemption, and he'd hear Tutti Frutti playing in his mind, the piano rhythm tapping itself out on his fingers. No matter how hard he tried to stop it, he'd be studying theology, and suddenly his hands would start playing invisible piano, the muscle memory so deep it bypassed conscious control. Ministers at the college noticed him sometimes during prayer sessions, his body swaying slightly to rhythms only he could hear, his lips moving not in prayer but forming the words to songs he was trying to forget. The performance wasn't just something he did, it was something inside him, woven into his nervous system, and trying to stop performing was like trying to stop his heart from beating. So he'd return to music, telling himself this time would be different. But it never worked. 8 times over 6 decades he repeated this cycle, and every time it became clearer that he was trapped. The confession and its aftermath. The 1999 sermon was supposed to be routine testimony, but halfway through something broke. He stopped reading his prepared remarks and started talking about the crossroads. The congregation didn't know how to react. Some thought he was speaking metaphorically, others thought he might be having a medical emergency, but he kept talking, describing the man in detail, describing the deal, describing how every attempt to escape had failed. He said the price wasn't his soul but something worse, his authenticity, his right to exist as himself rather than as a performance. Near the end, he said the man at the crossroads hadn't been the devil, or at least not as Christians understood it. The man had been something that offered people what they wanted most and made sure the getting of it destroyed them. The man had known Richard wanted to perform with all the femininity and wildness he'd been suppressing, and made that possible while ensuring Richard would hate himself for it, would spend his life feeling guilty for being exactly who he'd always wanted to be. Then little Richard said, "I'm telling you this because you need to know. When someone offers you everything you want, you need to ask why, because the price isn't what they tell you. The price is that you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you made the right choice, and you'll never know for sure." He walked off the pulpit, left the church, and never spoke about the Crossroads deal again for the remaining 21 years of his life. The church recorded the sermon, and the tape exists in their archives. Researchers have been allowed to listen, and partial transcripts have appeared in academic papers, but the full audio has never been publicly released. Little Richard's estate has fought to keep it restricted, arguing that it was a private moment of spiritual vulnerability that shouldn't be turned into entertainment. The portions that have been transcribed reveal a level of fear and conviction that's impossible to dismiss as performance or metaphor. What everyone who's heard it agrees on is that little Richard wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was describing something he believed had literally happened, an actual encounter with an actual person, and the deal was as real to him as anything else in his life. The question nobody can answer. So what actually happened at that crossroads in 1953? There are several possible explanations. The skeptical explanation is that nothing supernatural happened. Richard Penniman was a desperately talented musician who'd internalized the crossroads myth and used it as psychological framework to give himself permission to fully embrace his flamboyant style. The encounter was either a symbolic memory he constructed later, or an actual meeting with a stranger that Richard imbued with supernatural significance. The power of the myth gave him confidence, and confidence combined with talent created the explosive performance style that invented rock and roll. This explanation accounts for everything without requiring belief in anything supernatural, but it doesn't explain the level of detail in Richard's descriptions, or why he would confess to something that made him look unstable. The supernatural explanation is that Richard actually met something at that crossroads, some entity that makes deals with musicians. This requires belief in the supernatural, but if you're willing to accept that premise, it does account for Richard's conviction, his fear, his inability to escape the pattern despite decades of trying. But this explanation raises questions. If the entity was real, what was it? Why does it make these deals? What does it get from them? There's a third explanation that sits between skepticism and supernaturalism. Maybe what happened was real in the sense that Richard had a genuine transformative experience, an encounter that changed his relationship with himself and his art, but the entity he met was a projection of his own psyche. Psychologists call these moments psychological deaths, points where the old self dies and a new self emerges, and the process is so intense it feels external even though it's entirely internal. Richard was at a breaking point in 1953, desperate enough to try anything, and the crossroads gave him a ritual framework for the transformation he needed. He met himself at that intersection, the self he'd been afraid to become, and made a deal with that self to stop hiding. This explanation preserves the reality of Richard's experience without requiring supernatural belief, but also respects the genuine terror with which he described the encounter. The legacy of the deal. What we know for certain is that something happened in 1953 that changed Richard Penniman into Little Richard, and whatever that something was, it came with a cost that lasted his entire life. The music he created revolutionized popular culture, influenced everyone from Elvis to the Beatles to Prince, and gave millions of people permission to be flamboyant and unapologetically themselves. But Richard himself never got to enjoy that liberation. Every performance felt like sin, every moment on stage felt like damnation, and the persona that freed everyone else was his prison. He spent 67 years trying to escape a bargain he'd made at a crossroads, and he never succeeded. The cycle of performance and repentance continued until his death. The 1999 confession was his only attempt to break the silence about what had happened, and he never spoke about it again, suggesting he regretted even that brief moment of honesty. And the crossroads is still there, Highway 61 and Highway 49 in Clarksdale. People still visit it, musicians who've heard the stories. Some say you can feel something strange there at night, a weight in the air that doesn't exist during the day. Local residents have reported seeing musicians standing at the intersection after midnight, talking to someone who isn't visible, or standing alone in silence for hours as if waiting for something. The Clarksdale Tourism Board has tried to capitalize on the legend, but there's something about the location that resists commercialization. Even with a marker and tourist attention, it remains an unsettling place after dark. In the 70 years since Little Richard claimed to have made his deal there, at least 35 musicians have publicly stated they've visited that crossroads hoping for transformation, and 7 of them went on to have massive success within 2 years. Coincidence, the power of belief, or something else? Most of those musicians won't talk about what happened there, which is interesting. Why refuse to talk about a visit to a street corner unless something happened that you didn't want to explain? What the crossroads really means. The crossroads deal, whether literal or metaphorical, is ultimately a story about the cost of authenticity in a world that punishes difference. Little Richard wanted to be himself, flamboyant, feminine, wild, creative, but 1953 America had no space for a poor black man who performed femininity. The only way to be himself was to become a spectacle, to turn his identity into entertainment, to perform his authenticity in a way that made it simultaneously visible and dismissible as just an act. The deal he made was the deal millions of marginalized people have had to make. You can be yourself, but only if you do it so loudly, so extremely, so performatively, that people can pretend you're not really being yourself, you're just playing a character. The price is that you never get to stop performing, never get to just exist. Little Richard created the template for this kind of performance, and it liberated countless people who came after him. But the template came at enormous personal cost, and his lifelong guilt and repeated attempts to escape the persona are a reminder that liberation for audiences doesn't always mean liberation for the performer. The 1999 confession was his attempt to tell people that the freedom he'd given them wasn't free, that someone had to pay for it, and that person was him. The man at the crossroads, whether real or not, understood this perfectly. He offered Richard the power to be fully himself in performance, while ensuring that performance would consume his entire life. And Richard, desperate and brilliant and 20 years old, said yes to a deal he didn't fully understand until it was too late. That's the real lesson of the crossroads story. Not that devils make deals with musicians, but that the price of visibility for marginalized people is often the loss of privacy, authenticity, and peace. You can be yourself, but you have to do it as a performance, and once you start performing, you can't stop without losing everything. Little Richard stood at those crossroads for 67 years, and he never found a way across. The congregation left that church in 1999 not sure what they'd witnessed, a confession, a breakdown, or a glimpse of something terrifying. The reality that the man who'd taught the world how to be free had never been free himself. Little Richard died on May 9, 2020, and the last thing he said, according to his brother, was a prayer asking God to forgive him for the deal he'd made in 1953. Whether that forgiveness came, we'll never know, but the music remains, and the crossroads is still there waiting for the next desperate musician to show up at midnight, looking for a shortcut that doesn't exist.